The first time I heard any music by him was, it's almost unbelievable. It was in my hometown in Linz, a concert performance of Fredegundis, one of his two operas. So that was the first time I really heard any note written by him. I remember the conductor was Ernst Merzendorfer, who was famous for always, digging into archives and finding this and that. And then I got interested because it was very powerful, and this late romantic style really spoke to me. And then the next thing I heard was Notre Dame, the intermezzo, and then I actually heard the entire opera at the Wiener Volksoper, also in the 70s, which I think was not a very good performance from what I can recall. And then my teacher in Linz, in my school, after we had tackled with our chorus, Missa Solemnis by Beethoven, he said, so the next step is book with the Seven Seals. So there I was, I think I was 22 or 23 when he told me, next year you're going to conduct that. So that was a lot of work. And we played several performances. We even took it then to the Musikverein in Vienna. And there's a funny story about that, because the Wiener Singverein, they will premiere the piece. And so they, in those days, they would sing it every year with Horst Stein or other conductors. And so I think it was in 84, in the spring of 84, or 85, I can't remember now, but anyway, they were doing it with my youth orchestra in the Musikverein in Vienna. And so I insisted on 3 piano rehearsals with the chorus. And they told me, we know it. And having done it with our chorus, well, we really rehearsed every note, every measure, every voice very meticulously. I came into that rehearsal and I was young and had I was impudent enough to say, okay, let's start with the big fugue, the Wasserfuge. And it turned out they could sing always the theme, but everything in between was sort of a lot of text and a lot of wrong notes.
And the notes are quite important in that.
So I took them apart, and it was a little embarrassing for them, but it was actually the beginning of a long, lifelong friendship, really, with that chorus. And since then, they have improved enormously, and they are wonderful. But that was book with the Seven Seals sort of became one of my, one of the choral pieces which I did it at the proms. I did it here in Cleveland, and I recorded it at the Bayerische Rundfunk, and I think it's the masterpiece. And then especially when I started guest conducting, Schmidt Symphony No. 4 became one of my sort of signature pieces, which I took to the Philadelphia Orchestra and the Atlanta Symphony. And I can't remember all of them, but it always went down very well, because I think people got into that language, which is sort of very personal, especially in a piece like the Fourth Symphony, or also with the book with the Seven Seals. So I know a little bit about him. He must have been quite an extraordinary musical genius, also in the sense that his students said he could play any piano piece from memory, from the big repertoire he was teaching to his students. So, and I was always intrigued that he played the solo cello in the opera house for Gustav Mahler. That for me was always something really extraordinary. And the funny saying is in the Vienna Philharmonic that he wrote such difficult string parts simply to annoy his colleagues. I don't know if that is true, but that's what they say. Because, you know, with all the enharmonics exchanges and whatnot, I mean, it's at the beginning, sometimes it's really difficult to read simply. But I would say that counts for most of the music which was written in the early 20th century. I mean, if you look at Alban Berg or Schoenberg or any of these guys, it's sometimes really sort of impractical what you have in front of you on paper. Yeah, so.
Yeah, well, I like the saying that, was it Hans Keller who said that he was the most complete musician he'd ever met?
Yeah, I think that is extraordinary. I mean, when you read his biography, and he was teaching composition, conducting, piano, cello, I mean, counterpoint, whatever. So
organ, yeah,
organ. You know, it's quite amazing the achievements in his life. But you know, I think one of the problems for him is that in like the first 30-something years of the 20th century, he was then considered already old-fashioned. And also when you look at Vienna, let's say between 1890 and 1930, there was so much going on. Not just in music, but especially in music. You know, it took Gustav Mahler quite some time to become really established with his music, his own music. But, you know, there was such an enormous amount, quantity and quality going on in Vienna at that time that maybe if he would have been in a different city, he would have gone to fame much quicker. Competition was just too big, I think.
Do you find that there's something particularly Viennese about his writing, or particularly Viennese about the way that one can play it? And
yes, I think it's simply the kind of legato he requires, which sometimes, you know, goes over big intervals above an octave. I think that is sort of very typical Austrian, which seriously comes from folk music, from yodeling, nothing else. And so I think that is really, and when you know how the Vienna Philharmonic plays, and especially the older players who have been in the orchestra for 40 years or even more than that, like Rainer Köchel, before he retired a couple of years ago, I think he was in the orchestra like for, yeah, something like 40 years. And the way they would play was always trying to connect all the notes as sort of dense as possible. And so I think one of the key elements in his music, also as he has been an opera musician, as a solo cellist, is very much the kind of singing quality you need to have for this music. When you listen to singers, recordings from, you know, the 30s, 40s. I think you get a good impression of what that music should sound like, how you should approach it, from a very singing sort of corner. I think that is one of the most important things in his music.
Well, it particularly comes through. I think his horn writing is some of the most extraordinary that there is, particularly the sort of the horn chorales, the 4 polyphonic parts that he writes in all of the symphonies and the book. And you have to, everything has to just be connected. Otherwise
you know, and when you listen to the horn players from the Vienna Philharmonic playing on Viennese horns, well, all that is not just very difficult, but actually it's a necessity that you play with that kind of legato. Then I think I mean, look at the Second Symphony. I mean, the horn parts are just horrendous, really. I mean, you need an outstanding horn group for that. Or also in the fourth, like in the last movement, you know. I think he really wrote that with the sound of his colleagues in his ear. And when you look at the triple horn and how easy all that is made simply because of more valves, you take away some sort of core ingredients of how I think this music should be expressed. That counts for, in my view, Gustav Mahler as well.
Yeah, absolutely. The other thing that this sort of legato of every line makes difficult is that he writes really contrapuntal music. And particularly when you've recorded his stuff, have you had to really work to get the inner voices and the under voices to sing out and to be balanced well?
Yes, absolutely. You know, it's so easy to fall into that trap that you go for the top line and you try to make the fundament, the bass line sound good, and in between, okay, whatever happens. You have that with a lot of pianists actually as well. But in the orchestra, it's the same stuff. You know, how many times do you have to, and actually in a way in his music, as there's so much counterpoint, in a way it's easier, you know, a second clarinet player, a second bassoon player, or a second flute player, a second horn player, to encourage them actually to lead a color or an espressivo and not leave it just to the melody on top of that. That's his music. I find if it doesn't have that inner richness, it sort of sounds like, it sounds nice going through a lot of different keys very quickly, but the sort of inner red line is missing. And that comes really very much out of how you spin the sound. And spinning a sound in with a big orchestra is very much determined by the middle voices.
When we met before, we spoke a bit about the Musikverein and how it's quite a loud hall. And so you have to actually play with a little softness in there. Now, you obviously have a lot of experience in that hall. Is there something about the physicality and maybe the opera house that leads to opening up this sound and creating this inner spinning?
You know, it was so interesting. Once a now retired bassoon player of the Vienna Philharmonic said to me, you know, in the opera house, we play twice as loud as in the Musikverein. And the acoustics of the Vienna State Opera are fantastic. But, you know, it's 2,400 seats. something like that. And the Musikverein is so much more intimate and has, of course, also quite a lot more reverberance. So you have to dim it down and dynamically. So otherwise you take away a lot of the bloom of the sound if you force it. And I think that's also one thing, if it's Franz Schmidt, if it's Gustav Mahler, Richard Strauss, especially as well, it's important that I think that you don't go for the big brush, that these people wrote their music still with sort of Beethoven behind the last corner. It's not that far away, time-wise. And so what I'm trying to say is that kind of classical thinking, I think, was still a big part of these composers, and having structure and not just going after, every little turn is a little rubato. No, it's not. You have to have structure, and within that structure, you have to fill that with beauty, with colors. But Franz Schmidt still writes in the sonata form, first movement, and so on and so on. So
seconds and thirds and fourth.
Yeah. So I think you really need to have that also in your mind, that you don't fall into the trap of temptation, just taking a nice bath in sound. That's not what it is. And he was also accused of that later in his life, being conservative, being too strict, with being too rigid with all that. But for me, it makes absolute sense, because architecture and music is a very important part. And if we just go for a nice moment, we will have many, many, many nice moments, but in the end, it actually gets boring if you don't have a good structure to it. And Franz Schmidt definitely, if you look at the piano concerto, if you look at the symphonies, the sonatas, whatever piece, he was very well aware that it needs architecture in music.
Yeah, well, his manuscripts are almost like sort of contrapuntal exercises, where he works out perfection and note and balances, and then sort of expands that. When we spoke last time, you spoke about Walter Barelli, who you knew and who sort of, I think you said, had played with Schmidt or for Schmidt. And
no, he played when he started as a very young man. I mean, he was 17 or 18 when he joined the Vienna Philharmonic, and he sat next to Arnold Rosé, the brother-in-law of Gustav Mahler, who was first concertmaster at the Vienna Philharmonic, in the Vienna Philharmonic for over 50 years. So, I talked to Mr. Barelli about the way they played in those days, starting with the stupid question, vibrato or no vibrato, all that nonsense. And he said, of course we played with vibrato. And also because, there's this myth out there that you would play with vibrato when you played solo or chamber music, but not when you played in the orchestra, which he told me was total nonsense. It's not like you just switch somewhere in your brain. Oh, now I'm sitting in the orchestra and I don't vibrate anymore. Makes no sense whatsoever. And he confirmed that. And he also confirmed that it was not just the left hand. It was very much the intensity of the stroke of the bow. How to play a true legato with your right hand. And that is also something which I have to say we're losing more and more because we are so used to now with the authentic movement. I'm not, you know, I'm not sort of want to badmouth that. I've heard fantastic performances, like with William Christie. I think he's wonderful at that repertoire because he keeps it singing rather than being aggressive in it. But he said, you know, the legato in the right hand. I think we now sort of lost that because we're used to every downbow is an accent, every new stroke is an accent. And in those days, the art was really that you wouldn't hear the change of the bow. That was true legato. And that's something which I really believe that if we talk about historically well-informed performances, then we should be aware that in the times of Franz Schmidt, legato was something which they really knew how to do. And again, I refer to old recordings of great singers. And it doesn't matter if you listen to, you know, Caruso or Flagstad or, you know, from which area ever. But the art of legato was a very, very important component of the music of that time and the style of performing.
Mm-hmm. That's brilliant. Is there anything else you would like to say about Schmidt?
Yes, I would like to say something because, you know, he's suffering also from the political side. One has to be, you know, history also is not black or white. First of all, a genius doesn't have to be necessarily a nice human being. I don't think Beethoven was a nice human being. Stravinsky definitely was not a nice human being, and so on and so on. But then you have to see, you have to look at Austria between 1918 and 1938. A lot of people in those days, actually a vast majority, were convinced that the only way that Austria, as an all of a sudden amputated country, it was, you know, it was one of the biggest countries on the planet before 1918. It was a huge empire. And then all of a sudden it was reduced to that little spot on the map, which it is still. And a lot of people were convinced that the only way to survive for Austria was to form some kind of union with Germany, or even become a part of Germany. Now, in retrospective, of course, the Anschluss in 1938 was horrible, but one has to understand the thinking at that time. I remember my grandmother, she told me that like end of the 20s, beginning of the 30s, if she would leave the house and go and buy some bread in the bakery, and she had her handbag full of money, when she arrived at the bakery, it was not enough because inflation was so bad. So, you know, just very simply saying Franz Schmidt was a kind of Nazi is too simple. He was part of the vast majority of Austrians, out of the reasons which I just explained, thinking that Austria on itself absolutely will not survive. And the best way to keep your culture would be to form an alliance with Germany, because they were afraid after World War I that maybe the Russians would take over. Maybe other countries would try to invade Austria. So, I think anyway, also people can change their minds and their political views. I'm just trying to make a case that for whatever is historically correct of the political views, and I think also changing views of Franz Schmidt, it should not color our appreciation of how wonderful his music is. And it really deserves to be heard and performed.
Well, I think there's an additional part to this, which is that he was really defended after he died by a lot of Jewish musicians. So
Yes.
whilst he maybe believed in the nationalistic side, the anti-Semitic side by his friends, by his colleagues, has been proved not to be true about him.
Yeah, that's so right. So, you know, let's do more of it.